Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another week of Film History with Fred. I'm your host, Fred. Good to see you again, or good not to see you again. Wish you were here instead of this camera. But we're going to carry on with week 2 of post-break film history. We're going to talk about new European cinema, and we're going to focus on 2 different movements in Europe. But there were a lot of movements in film going on kind of in the period from the 60s through the 80s. Germany had a lot of cool stuff going on. Italy always has interesting film, but we want to focus on France and Great Britain this week. And we're going to start with the French New Wave. This is one of the most famous movements in film history. Really, if you look back at film history at the very beginnings, a lot of the big changes in film language were happening at the very beginning, like with D.W. Griffith, the Soviets, the Germans, kind of the language of film had been established once we got into the 20s. But with the French New Wave, we really see, I guess, a new language emerge in film for the first time in a long time. They really experimented with film in ways that had never been done before. So we're going to focus on some of the key directors of the French New Wave, some of the themes and stylistics of that. We'll set the stage with a little history. As usual, typically whenever there is an artistic renaissance, there tends to be something difficult going on in the country at the time. For France, it was primarily the Algerian War. You could think of the Algerian War almost as our Vietnam War. It was highly unpopular. The government was heavily criticized for their violent, brutal methods in this war, so it really caused a lot of turmoil in the country at the time. Now, out of this turmoil emerged this movement of filmmakers, and we kind of talked about them a little bit last week when we talked about the classic film auteurs, this group of filmmakers who worked for that film magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma. Many of those filmmakers were the ones who founded this movement called the French New Wave. Very experimental, very original movement in film. You see these critics, these film critics who had studied film all their lives, and now they started making their own films, and they kind of rebelled against the way films were made. And you see that specifically with one filmmaker named Jean-Luc Godard. But they started to kind of tear apart structure, break the rules of style and invisible editing and all those things to create, like we said, a new film language. So, just some common themes. Philosophy people out there, I'm sure you've heard of existentialism. Really, this is a philosophy that permeates a lot of our modern culture. It's defined a lot by alienation and freedom and boredom and all those things. It really was born in France. Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, they were pretty famous people who either wrote philosophy or even, in Camus' case, he was a writer of literature, but they all had these existential themes. So that was really heavily influential in the work of a lot of the French filmmakers during this time. They also employed a lot of what we call alienation effect into their work. They were trying to get people to get less emotionally involved in films and think more about the ideas being presented. So they were always trying to find ways to pull people out of the story. And I'll talk about some specific techniques here in a second. And just some other quick themes. They were big into personal expression. They studied all these Hollywood filmmakers working within the Hollywood system who had these rules they had to adhere to. But with the French, they were pretty free. It was more independent cinema in a way. So they got to express their own feelings, a lot of autobiographical work during this period. So you see a lot of that kind of more freedom in their work. You see a lot of distrust of authority. That kind of stems a lot from what's going on in the government, and especially with the war at the time. With romantic relationships, the French are always dealing with love in their films. And with the French New Wave, relationships typically are doomed. Very few relationships end up happy. So that's some of the common themes we'll see. I think the most interesting part, though, of the French New Wave is really the style. And this is where they're really innovative. First, just the construction of these films. Plot was less important to them. They had like these loose plots, but they really tore it up. They did a lot of non-linear storytelling where we're bouncing around. Definitely a lot of handheld camera, a lot of natural light, tons of strange editing techniques, again, partly to kind of pull us out of the story. But it was a very loose, almost a little bit like Italian neorealism in some way, very almost guerrilla style filmmaking at times. But structurally, don't look for a lot of plot in these films. It's more about ideas. It's more about kind of the atmosphere that they're creating. Related to that alienation effect is that thing called reflexivity. These are just specific techniques that are used to, again, pull the viewer out of the story. They'd have the actor look directly into the camera. They put title cards up on the screen. They'd have purposeful jump cuts, all to, again, distract you, keep you from getting too connected with the characters. And again, it all goes back to them wanting you to understand the ideas as opposed to being distracted by the emotions of what's going on. As far as the narratives themselves, a lot of ambiguity in these stories, a lot of unresolved plots. The film 400 Blows famously ends on a freeze frame, just to kind of suggest that the story is not ended. And this happens quite often in French New Wave films, where they're not willing to bring some kind of clean, tidy ending to their story. Three filmmakers I want to talk about. Probably the most well-known French New Wave filmmaker is Jean-Luc Godard. Now, he's one of the most prolific filmmakers ever. You see that number there, like 120-something films made over his career. He's always making films. He's still making films today. He's probably in his late 80s right now, and he's still making movies. He's a difficult filmmaker to watch. I'm not a big fan of Godard personally because he's a little bit cold. He's a Marxist, and he always is kind of espousing those ideas into his work. It's hard, I think, to watch films, at least for some people, where you're not able to emotionally connect to characters. But he doesn't really care. He's all about trying to get ideas and kind of destroying the form of film. He really wanted to kind of radicalize filmmaking. He felt like it had become stale, and he wanted to create a revolution, for lack of a better term. So Godard, just some things in his work, definitely big into pop culture. His films are always about young people, just dealing with the problems of youth. So he's obsessed with the things that young people at the time were obsessed with. Of course, music and just clothing and all those other kind of things. Those are the topics. That's kind of what gets blended into the stories of his films. He's a really difficult filmmaker as far as his style to get, I guess, engaged with at times. Now, it's really interesting. His films are definitely interesting to watch, and some people love that kind of style, but he's always got this fragmented narrative where he's always breaking into it with jump cuts and things like that. He really kind of fit all those stylistic things we talked about on the other screen. So I always hesitate to watch or to show a Godard film in this class. I've never shown one before just because I do think they're difficult to connect with. I think of the French New Wave filmmakers, the one that for me is the easiest to connect with is Francois Truffaut, who we'll talk about here in a second. But you kind of see Godard, the very French quote there on his views of art and film. You can kind of see a little bit of that revolutionary spirit in this quote right here, just kind of wanting to tear apart and to explore truth in film the way he sees it. But that kind of leads us to Truffaut, who personally, he's my favorite new wave director, just because he's making films that are more accessible, I think, emotionally. You can watch a Truffaut film and get connected to the characters, get pulled into a story. He does a lot less of those distancing devices that other new wave filmmakers would do. His films lean towards autobiographical material. He was a little bit of a rebellious youth. He got in a lot of trouble as a young boy, and that story gets told many times through this character that he follows, starting with a film called The 400 Blows, which is really his greatest film, the film I most recommend that you check out. So a lot of his own life kind of gets pulled into his stories. Because of his troubled youth, you'll see a lot of stories that deal with youth in opposition to adults, authority figures, hindering, restricting young people, and you see a lot of his early films dealing with that. As he progresses through his career, though, he tends to soften, I guess maybe age and maybe just a little more distance between his youth and now late adulthood. He kind of softened on his adult characters, and they tended to be a little bit more tender towards young people and children. Just some other things. He liked zoom lenses. Zooms were just becoming popular during this time, so the French New Wave, of course, loved to use these new techniques. So you see a lot of zoom shots in his films. His editing tended to be kind of choppy, which was pretty standard for most French New Wave filmmakers. And you see these big shifts in mood. 400 Blows, again, that's my favorite film by him. There's all kinds of tonal shifts in that film. It's almost like two separate movies that you're watching. But definitely he's one I think is worth checking out. Now the third filmmaker I'm going to talk about, Robert Bresson, he's not a French New Wave filmmaker. The only reason I'm talking about him is because he worked during the same time as the French New Wave. His most productive years were during those 1960s when the French New Wave was active. But he didn't really follow the same themes and style, but he's considered one of the great filmmakers of all time. So I mentioned him here, partly because he's a great filmmaker, but also because we're going to watch a film by him for our film this week, Au Hasard, Balthazar. Just a few things about Bresson. He's not for everybody. Personally, I like his films, but you have to be patient with them because they tend to be really simple, at least plots. They're not tightly plotted films. It's more about kind of routine. It's more about somebody going through processes. There's one film called A Man Escaped, and it's like a prison break film. And really the whole film is kind of following this process of this man trying to break out of prison. It's really detailed. He loves these really short shots, tightly edited scenes, very sparse soundtracks, very sparse. I mean, rarely does he use music. Very tightly, I think, cut moments to kind of get to the points that he's trying to get to. Tonight's film, or the one that you're going to watch for this week, Au Hasard, Balthazar, is one of the few films of his that actually does have some music cues in it, which personally I think are pretty effective in this film. As far as his stories, pretty mysterious storytelling. I mean, for me, I think his stories are pretty haunting. I think tonight's film is my favorite by him, just because there's a character, and actually the main character in this film is a donkey, and we're going to follow the path of this donkey as he goes from owner to owner. And I just feel like there is a mystery to this story, and there's a lot of symbolism to the donkey in this story. And it leads to a really kind of almost ethereal conclusion that you'll get to see. But his stories deal a lot with faith. He was Catholic, so that kind of permeates a lot of his stories. His later films do become a little bit more pessimistic, a little darker as he kind of got older, but his earlier films tend to have a little bit of hopefulness to them. Some other things you'll see, I think one of the more interesting things about Bresson is that he did not like to work with actors. He felt like actors brought this falseness to the screen that he was not interested in. So he'd rather work with non-actors who were real and try to mold them to the performance that he needed. Now, partly because of this, he would have trouble maybe getting performances at time, or he tried to minimize how much they'd have to say. So a lot of his films are very quiet, not a lot of dialogue, partly because he's working with non-actors who just can't deliver the lines quite the way he needs them to. But that's kind of an interesting aspect of his work. Key films from this period. Again, this is primarily kind of 60s is the period we're looking at here. Some of the main films that got this period started, Hiroshima Mon Amour, that's a Rene film. Foreigner Blows, out of this list right here, other than, well, personally I put Foreigner Blows and Au Hasard Balthazar. Those are two really great films that I think are worth seeing. If you do feel adventurous and you want to check out a Godard film, I'd start with Breathless. That's the one that got his career started. That was his first feature film. That's the one that really set the bar for what French New Wave film was going to be. Okay, I got a couple clips I'm going to show you. I'll show you one from Truffaut, Foreigner Blows, and I'll show you one from Godard for Breathless. Actually, no, Masculine Feminine is the film I'm going to show you for that. And you can really see the difference between those two filmmaker styles with these clips. Be right back.
L'important souci qui sans fin me tourmente, et vu tant de regrets desquels je me lamente, tout éveille souvent et je ne chante, manie, je pleure mes ennuis, ou pour leur dire mieux en pleurant je les chante, si bien qu'en les chantant, souvent je les enchante. Voilà pourquoi manie, je pleure jour et nuit. Chante ainsi l'ouvrier faisant son ouvrage, ainsi le laboureur faisant son labourage, ainsi l'aventurier songeant à sa dame, ainsi le marinier en tirant à la rame, ainsi le pèlerin regrettant sa maison, ainsi le prisonnier maudissant sa prison.
Monet, si votre copie se présente la première, c'est que j'ai décidé aujourd'hui de donner les résultats dans l'ordre inverse du mérite. Oui, la recherche de l'absolu vous a conduit droit au zéro, mon ami. Pour les autres moins familiers de Balzac, je dirais qu'il s'agit d'une ténébreuse affaire. Oui, que votre ami Douanet ait cru devoir choisir pour sujet la mort de son aïeul, c'était son droit. Bien que nous sachions qu'il n'hésite pas à sacrifier ses proches quand ça peut lui être utile.
C'est pourquoi, monsieur, je n'ai pas copié.
Ah, on en juge. Soudain, le moribond se dressa sur son lit et jeta sur ses enfants pleins de terreur un regard foudroyant. Les cheveux qui lui garnissaient le crâne se dressèrent, ses sourcils se relevèrent. Son visage s'anima comme si le feu s'y éteignit, ce qui le rendit sublime. Il leva un poing crispé par la rage et cria d'une voix de tonnerre le fameux mot d'Archibald, leur écart j'ai trouvé. Et bien moi aussi j'ai trouvé, Mollel. Vous êtes un abominable plagiaire.
C'est pas vrai, monsieur.
Allez immédiatement porter votre copier, monsieur le directeur. Tenez, Colomel. Accompagnez-le. Et dites-lui que je ne veux plus vous voir d'ici la fin du trimestre.
Qu'est-ce qu'il prend? Je n'ai pas copié, j'étais assis à côté de lui, je l'aurais vu.
Ah, il est exclu, vous aussi?
Il ne verra pas.
Encore une insolence? Sortez!
Sortir.
Foutez la chambre!
C'est pas légal.
Monsieur Paul, je vais vous montrer qu'il fait la moi ici, moi! C'est pas légal! Ah, c'est pas légal! Alors, vous allez l'emmener chez monsieur le directeur?
Non, il s'est sauvé.
Il s'est sauvé! Vite!
Okay, with that clip, you really see that primary theme of Truffaut's, that kind of conflict between adults and young people, but you also just see the instincts he has as a filmmaker. This is his first film, but just the way he handles the camera, how he works with actors, and just the staging of the scene, definitely a born filmmaker. This next clip is by Godard, and this is from a film called Masculine Feminine, and you're going to see a distinct difference in style and tone with this clip.
Amour, amour, au cœur de la solitude. Ton visage renversé, son front de femme toute nue. Mon amour dans la mer, dans les songes, et me voici contre la mort.
Tout se passe sur la terre, la plus atroce des étoiles, et parmi les hommes, plus cruels que les pierres. S'il vous plaît.
On est la ficelle. Était là. Vous avez entendu parler de Marquis de Sade?
Oui, c'est lui qui a dit Français, encore un effort pour être républicain.
Un peuple remonta l'épée de Joël, lança à travers l'Europe la première armée de la justice, et pendant 100 ans, cette armée en avion remplit les plus nobles rêves du monde. Il savait chasser le matin, passer les grèves des lois, et secouer les voix, avant d'affaire M. Mitterrand, avec ce bon rôtiment, qui firent danser les hommes autour de la liberté.
Il faut pas s'appeler le temps chéri.
Je ne peux plus quand tes promesses tu m'as fait mentir. D'autres filles à ces promesses ont déjà dit oui. Dernier temps de mes larmes.
Okay, you can probably see why I don't show a whole lot of Godard in this class. His style is difficult to connect to. You saw a lot of those distancing devices in that particular clip, things like actresses looking directly into the lens. You see title cards, jump cuts. They had that strange sound mix where suddenly all the sound just disappeared. And also you see Godard getting his thematic ideas out there just through dialogue, talking about his thoughts. I mean, poetry being read. That's pretty representative of what a Godard film would be like. Okay, that's enough of French New Wave. Let's start transitioning over to a period called British social realism. Now, just to kind of set the stage for this, really, the British have been making films from the start, but really in the early days of film, you couldn't point and look at British film and say there was one specific thing that made them unique. There wasn't really any particular themes or stylistics about their work. They were very technically excellent. They had great actors, but they didn't have like a real national identity, the way like the Italian neorealists or the French Golden Age or Japanese cinema, all those things kind of had more of an identity. Things start to change really kind of late 50s, early 60s. There's a movement called the social realist movement. And really what it was is it was kind of a rebellion against the aristocracy, you know, the social classes in Great Britain. You get a lot of documentary filmmakers in this period. You get a lot of playwrights. They were called the Angry Young Men. That was the name of this group, who started gravitating toward film and started telling these stories that were more about everyday life and kind of the real social problems going on in England. Because a lot of the British films, you know, are all about, you know, kind of like Downton Abbey kind of stuff. That was the story you would expect. And these filmmakers wanted to tell more of the gritty, real stuff that was happening, you know, outside of the cities in the more industrial parts of Great Britain. So this movement you see here, it kind of went, you know, from the late 50s, early 60s, and then kind of died down for a while. But it was during this period, I know you're not old enough to remember Margaret Thatcher, but she was prime minister at the same time Ronald Reagan was president. She's a very conservative prime minister, and a lot of the youth, the working class, rebelled against that type of conservatism. So again, you see this kind of upheaval going on in the country at the time. So there's a resurgence in this social realist movement that takes place. They're a little different. The style of these new social realist films were different than that more documentary style you see in the 60s, but it's still got a lot of the same themes and a lot of storylines. Another reason why there was such a, I think, a big explosion of films in the 80s was because of Channel 4 in Great Britain. Think of Channel 4 as kind of like the PBS of Great Britain, and they started financing independent film, and they started giving money to these really up-and-coming indie filmmakers, and there's a lot of great content that came out during the 80s, and a lot of it, I think, would be considered social realist. As far as some common themes with the social realist movement, definitely things we've already talked about. Just let's show common people in their own natural settings, and let's deal with those problems they encounter, you know, losing their jobs and just struggling to make it and all those kind of things. You see a lot of these films, you know, definitely working class type stories would be the stories they'd want to tell. There was a term for these films. They were called kitchen sink films, partly because there was this artist who painted things like kitchen sinks and toilets, and they kind of pulled that term from that. But really, in a more general sense, it's about the common things that go on in life, just the banality of life. These were things that were interesting to the social realist filmmakers, so they would show those kind of things. Definitely anti-establishment, so they wanted to get rid of all those kind of class barriers that were going on. They felt like there was too much separation between classes. And they also dealt a lot with things that had never been dealt with before, things like adultery and abortion and just these topics that were not considered, you know, proper for film. They took them on and dealt with them. Stylistically, as opposed to, you know, standard British film where we're going to be primarily studio shoots, they took it out into the locations, and they went kind of North London, you know, think Cleveland, think Detroit. That's kind of the areas that they wanted to go to and shoot these films. Surprisingly, some of these early films were pretty experimental, a little bit of influence from the French New Wave. So you see some, you know, kind of handheld shooting, you see some jump cut kind of editing, some loose cinematic construction. You do see a little bit of that influence in a lot of these filmmakers. And as we start to emerge into kind of more modern social realism, you see a much more vibrant, kinetic style. Some of you might know a filmmaker named Danny Boyle. He did a film called Slumdog Millionaire and 28 Days Later. If you've seen those films, you kind of know what his style is. I got a clip here from, or not a clip, but a shot here from Trainspotting, which was another Danny Boyle film. That's kind of a more common style for modern social realist film, just a little bit more fast-paced than what you'd see in the 60s. There's a lot of directors we could talk about. I don't want to dig too deep into any one director from this period because there's a lot to talk about. I just want to quickly talk about a few. Lindsay Anderson, he was one of the first social realist filmmakers. He kind of came in that first wave of social realist film. He was very anti-establishment, and he's also probably a little bit more experimental than most of the social realist filmmakers at the time. I'd say if you want to check out a film by Lindsay Anderson, I'd see a film called If. That's a really interesting film. It's got Malcolm McDowell, who you might know from A Clockwork Orange. Probably my favorite social realist filmmaker is a director named Neil Jordan. He's an Irish filmmaker, and he deals a lot with the turmoil that was going on, kind of the Northern Ireland conflict. He would deal directly with that in a lot of his films. But I think he's just a great storyteller. Really, you can connect, I think, with his protagonists. His protagonists are usually criminals, or they're kind of on the shady side of things, but they're always very sympathetic. It's like they get pulled into these circumstances, beyond their control, and you have really no choice but to connect and root for them. So I think that's what makes his films appealing to me. I'd say if you want to check out a film by him, there's probably two. The Crying Game is a great, great film, and Mona Lisa, I'll put a shot of that up on the screen here in a second. Those are probably the two films by Neil Jordan I would recommend. Mike Leigh, he's still working right now. He's a director who loves actors. A lot of his films are pretty improvisational, where there's not a whole lot of scripting. They just kind of let the actors go, which can kind of make them loose from a narrative standpoint. But they're funny, but there's sadness to his films, so he kind of blends all that. And it's all kind of taking place in this kind of working class setting. So that's kind of Mike Leigh in a nutshell. And that's also Mike Leigh and his hatred for Hollywood right there. Probably a lot of filmmakers feel the same way that Mike Leigh does. As far as some key films, I just put a couple examples up there on the screen. As far as recommending any one of these films, again, I like Neil Jordan a lot. Some of you might have heard of a guy named Steve McQueen before. He was the director of 12 Years a Slave. He made a film before that called Hunger, which is a really startling film in a lot of ways. It's about a guy who's going on hunger strike, and it's one of the amazing performances in film, if you ever want to check that film out. So that's it for New European Cinema. The film, again, that's going to be available on SEMO Canopy is Au Hasard Balthazar by Robert Bresson. Just be patient with this film. It'll be slow at times, but I think if you can stick with it, there's a real, nice conclusion to it that's worth the wait during those slower periods of the film. So I hope you enjoy it. Send me an email if you have any questions about what's going on in class, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care.